A 7-year-old girl walks through the downtown streets carrying a 2-year-old baby in her arms when she stops in front of the first well-dressed man she encounters. With tears in her eyes and her voice choked with desperation, she holds up some crumpled bills she saved for months to buy a doll and whispers, "Please, sir, would you take my little brother? I'll pay you everything I have." When she explains that she can no longer take care of him alone and that she prefers to see him with someone who can give him a better life, the millionaire is paralyzed by a situation that challenges everything he knows about value and sacrifice. What he decides to do next is absolutely shocking. The biting winter wind swept through the downtown streets like invisible blades, carrying with it the acrid smell of pollution mixed with the comforting aroma of fresh bread escaping from morning bakeries. Among the hurried crowd of people bundled in heavy coats, a small figure walked with determined but visibly tired steps. Helena was only 7 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of a lifetime of responsibilities. In her thin arms, she carefully held her 2-year-old brother, Miguel, who slept nestled against her chest. The girl's torn coat barely managed to protect them from the cold, and her shoes, full of holes, left her feet numb against the icy asphalt. Every step was calculated, every movement measured by the need not to wake the baby who represented her entire world. Helena had spent the night awake, walking the streets, seeking shelter in building doorways and under awnings, always with Miguel in her arms, always shielding him from the cold with her own body. Her savings, a few crumpled bills and coins she had collected for months doing odd jobs, were tucked into the inner pocket of her coat. It was enough money to buy that small doll with the blue dress she saw every morning in the toy store window. But now, looking at Miguel, Helena knew a doll would never be more important than her brother's life. Her stomach had been growling for hours, but she had given Miguel the last cookie she had found before he fell asleep. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a full meal. Her arms trembled from exhaustion, not just from the baby's weight, but from the emotional drain of carrying such a colossal responsibility all by herself. She stopped at a traffic light, watching the hurried people passing by, each lost in their own worlds, their own concerns. No one noticed 2 lost children in the middle of the crowd. No one saw the silent desperation in the eyes of a girl who had grown up too fast. That's when she saw him, a tall man, elegantly dressed, in an expensive overcoat and leather shoes that gleamed even in the grey morning light. He checked the gold watch on his wrist with the impatience of someone with important engagements. His greying hair was perfectly coiffed, and his posture radiated the kind of authority that comes only with power and money. Helena took a deep breath, her heart pounding so hard she feared it would wake Miguel. Her legs trembled, not from cold, but from courage mixed with terror. She knew she had only one chance, just one moment to change everything. With hesitant steps, she approached the man. Each foot seemed an eternity. Her eyes began to well up with tears, not tears of self-pity, but tears from a decision that was breaking her heart into pieces. When she finally got close enough, her voice came out as a hoarse whisper, choked with emotion and cold. "Please, sir." The man lowered his gaze, surprised by the unexpected interruption. His eyes met Helena's, and for an instant, the world seemed to stop. She clutched the crumpled bills in her free hand, extending them toward him with violently trembling fingers. "Would you take my little brother?" The words emerged as a painful confession, each syllable costing her a piece of her soul. "I'll pay you everything I have." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant traffic noise and the almost imperceptible sound of Miguel's breathing. Helena looked up, searching for some sign of compassion on the stranger's face, while her entire world hung in the balance of that impossible moment. Edward Miller had built a financial empire based on quick, calculated decisions, but in that moment, before the frail girl offering him a few crumpled bills in exchange for taking care of a baby, he felt utterly paralyzed. His hands, accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar contracts without hesitation, trembled slightly as they reached for the offered money, "What are you saying, child?" His voice came out harsher than he intended, masking the confusion that had seized his thoughts. For 45 years, Edward had lived in a world where everything had a price tag, where every relationship was a transaction, where emotions were luxuries he couldn't afford. Helena bit her lower lip, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "My little brother needs someone who can take good care of him. I can't anymore." The words came out brokenly, each costing her a superhuman effort. "You seem like a good person, with enough money to give him everything I can't." Miguel stirred in her arms, letting out a soft sigh that made Edward's heart clench in a way he couldn't comprehend. The baby's cheeks were rosy from the cold, his hair dark and curly, and even in sleep, there was a serenity on his face that contrasted dramatically with the visible desperation in his sister's eyes. "Where are your parents?" Edward asked, his voice now softer, barely noticing that he had knelt to meet the girl's eyes. "We don't have parents anymore," Helena replied with devastating simplicity. "It's just me and Miguel now, but I'm not enough for him. He deserves a real home, food every day, clean clothes." Her voice broke. "He deserves someone better than me." Edward felt something shatter inside his chest. He had grown up in orphanages, intimately familiar with the feeling of abandonment, the constant hunger, the cold that seeped into your bones. But never, not even in the most desperate moments of his own childhood, had he witnessed love as pure and sacrificial as that in the eyes of this girl. "And you?" he asked, surprised by his own question. "What would happen to you?" Helena shrugged, as if her own fate was irrelevant. "I'll manage. I always have. But Miguel is too little. He needs care I don't know how to give." She gently kissed her brother's forehead. "Please, sir, I know you must have a family, a big house. He'd be happy with you." People hurried past them, some casting curious glances at the unusual scene. A well-dressed businessman kneeling on the sidewalk, deep in conversation with a little girl carrying a baby. Edward didn't notice the stares, nor did he care. All his attention was focused on the impossible courage of that child. "How long have you two been alone?" he asked, instinctively extending his hands to help support Miguel's weight. "A few months." Helena hesitated for a moment before allowing him to help. "We sleep in different places every night. Sometimes we get to stay in shelters, but we always have to leave early in the morning." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a pain in his chest he hadn't experienced in decades. When he opened them again, his decision was made, even if he didn't yet know exactly what it was. "Keep your money," he said firmly, pushing the bills back into her hands. "Come with me. We'll have lunch somewhere warm, and then we can talk more about this." Helena looked at him suspiciously, clutching the money to her chest. "You're not going to call the police?" "No," Edward replied, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "I'm going to help you figure out the best solution." But even as he uttered those words, Edward knew his life had just taken a completely unexpected turn, and that nothing would ever be the same again. The upscale restaurant was only 2 blocks away, but to Helena, it felt like a journey to another world. Her dirty hands contrasted glaringly with the immaculate white tablecloth, and she huddled in her seat, feeling utterly out of place among the well-dressed patrons conversing in hushed tones. Edward had chosen a reserved table in the corner, away from curious glances. Miguel had woken up on the way and now observed everything around him with wide, childlike curiosity, making small sounds of enchantment at the sight of the golden chandeliers on the ceiling. "When was the last time you two had a hot meal?" Edward asked, studying the menu while discreetly observing Helena's reactions. The girl hesitated, mentally counting the days. "I think 3 days ago. A lady gave us soup at a shelter." She held Miguel more tightly, as if fearing someone might take him from her at any moment. "But he had a cookie yesterday morning." Edward's stomach churned. He called the waiter with a discreet gesture and ordered a variety of child-friendly dishes, along with warm milk for Miguel. Helena watched his every move with intense attention, as if trying to decipher his true intentions. "Why are you doing this, sir?" she asked when the waiter had left. "Rich people don't usually care about people like us." The question hit Edward unexpectedly. He himself didn't fully know how to answer. "Perhaps because I've been where you are." The words came out before he could filter them. "Perhaps because I know what it's like to be too small to solve problems too big." Helena tilted her head, studying him with a maturity disturbing for her age. "You didn't have a family when you were a child either." "Sir, no," Edward answered simply, surprised by his own honesty. It was the first time in decades he had spoken about his childhood to anyone. "I grew up in orphanages. I know what it's like to feel hunger, cold, fear." Helena's eyes lit up with something akin to hope. "So you understand. You know I only want what's best for Miguel." The food arrived, and Edward watched, fascinated, as Helena first prepared baby food for Miguel, carefully testing the temperature on her own hand, making sure each spoonful was perfect before offering it to her brother. Only after Miguel began to eat did she touch her own meal, and even then, she kept constant watch over the baby. "How long have you been taking care of him alone?" Edward asked, impressed by the girl's natural competence. "Since forever." "Really?" Helena explained while delicately wiping Miguel's face. "Our mom got very sick after he was born. I learned to change diapers, prepare bottles, give baths." Her voice trailed off. When she left, I promised I would always take care of him." Edward swallowed hard. "And you don't have other relatives? Grandparents, aunts, uncles?" Helena shook her head. "Our mom always said we only had each other. When the social workers came to take us, I ran away with Miguel. I didn't want them to separate us." "Are you running from social services?" Edward felt a pang of worry. "They wanted to put us in different families," Helena explained, her voice trembling. "They said it would be easier to find separate homes for us, but I can't let them separate us. Miguel is all I have." Edward observed the fierce determination in the 7-year-old girl's face and felt something stir deeply in his heart. He had built an empire based on logic and cold calculation, but faced with that unconditional love, all his defenses seemed ridiculously fragile. "Helena," he said softly, "what if I told you there's a way for you both to stay together? A way for Miguel to have everything he needs, without you having to give him up?" Her eyes instantly filled with tears. "That would be possible." Edward nodded slowly, knowing he was about to change 3 lives forever. "Yes, it would be possible, but first, you need to trust me." Edward's mansion loomed imposingly against the grey afternoon sky, its perfectly manicured gardens contrasting with the simplicity of the 2 children's worn clothes as they now walked hesitantly through the main entrance. Helena held Miguel with extra tightness, her eyes scanning every detail of the property with a mixture of awe and distrust. "Is this where you live, sir?" she asked, her small voice echoing in the high-ceilinged entrance hall, adorned with artworks that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Edward nodded, observing her reaction. "It's too big for just one person," he admitted, a confession he had never made before. It always felt more like a museum than a home. Maria, the housekeeper who had worked for Edward for over 15 years, appeared at the top of the marble staircase. Her eyes widened at the sight of the children, but her professional expression quickly masked her surprise. "Maria, these are Helena and Miguel," Edward said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "They'll be staying with us for a while. Could you prepare the guest rooms on the 2nd floor?" "Certainly, Mr. Miller," Maria replied, though her eyebrows remained slightly arched. "Should I prepare anything special for dinner? Something simple and nutritious?" Edward looked at Helena, who seemed even smaller in the gigantic hall. "And perhaps you could show Helena where everything is, the bathroom, the kitchen." Helena gently interrupted. "Mr. Miller, we don't want to bother you. We can sleep anywhere small. We don't need big rooms." The simplicity of those words hit Edward like a punch. He knelt in front of her, meeting her eyes. "Helena, while you're here, This house is yours too. You're no bother at all." Miguel had begun to whimper, and Helena immediately shifted her position to comfort him. "He's sleepy, but sometimes he has nightmares. I always sleep next to him so he won't be scared when he wakes up. The rooms Maria will prepare are right next to each other," Edward explained. "You can leave the door open between them." In the days that followed, Edward's rigorously organized routine was completely transformed. He woke to the sounds of Miguel playing in the room next to his study, and often found Helena in the library, poring over books with an intellectual hunger that deeply impressed him. "You read very well for someone who doesn't attend school regularly," he commented one morning, finding her absorbed in a children's storybook. Helena blushed. "I taught myself, reading old magazines people threw away, and our mum taught me a little before she got sick." She closed the book carefully. "I always wanted to go to a real school, with other boys and girls." Edward sat beside her in the large library armchair. "And what else would you like to do if you could do anything?" Helena's eyes sparkled with long-held dreams. "I'd like to learn to write beautiful stories. And I wish Miguel could play in a park every day without having to worry about where we're going to sleep at night." "What if I told you all of that is possible?" Edward asked softly. Helena looked at him cautiously. "Nothing in life is free, Mr. Miller. You always have to pay for everything, one way or another." The bitter wisdom of those words, coming from a 7-year-old child, broke Edward's heart. "Helena, what if I wanted to officially adopt both of you? What if I wanted you to be my children?" The book slipped from Helena's hands and fell to the floor with a muffled thump. She remained silent for a long moment, processing the words she had just heard. "Why?" she finally whispered. "Why would you do that for us, sir?" Edward took a deep breath, preparing for an honesty that scared him. "Because in all my life, I've never seen love as pure as what you have for Miguel. And because maybe you two can teach me how to be a real family." Helena studied him intently, as if trying to read his soul through his eyes. "What if it doesn't work out? What if you get tired of us?" "That will never happen," Edward replied with a conviction that surprised him. "But I understand you need time to trust me." Just then, Miguel appeared, toddling into the library, still sleepy from his afternoon nap, and headed directly for Edward, raising his little arms, asking to be picked up. When Edward lifted him, Miguel leaned his head on his shoulder with complete trust, and Helena knew that, perhaps for the first time in her life, it was offering something too good to be true. It was almost midnight when Edward heard the soft shuffle of bare feet in the hallway. He got out of bed and found Helena in the kitchen, preparing a bottle for Miguel with precise, silent movements, as if she had done it thousands of times. "He woke up hungry?" Edward asked softly, so as not to startle her. Helena jumped, almost dropping the bottle. "Sorry, Mr. Miller. I didn't mean to wake you. It's just that Miguel has strange feeding times, and I didn't want to bother Maria." "You don't have to apologize for taking care of your brother." Edward approached, noticing how she instinctively positioned herself between him and Miguel, who was in the makeshift high chair. "And you don't have to be afraid of bothering anyone here." Helena tested the milk's temperature on her own wrist before offering the bottle to Miguel. "On the street, you learn not to make noise. People don't like it when kids make noise at night." Edward sat at the kitchen table, observing Helena's maternal dedication. "Have you ever thought about being a mother when you grow up?" The question made Helena give a bitter laugh, too mature for her age. "I already am a mother, Mr. Miller. Ever since our mum got sick, I've been Miguel's mum." "That's not fair to you," Edward said softly. "You should be playing, studying, being a child." "Life isn't fair," Helena replied, wiping Miguel's face with a cloth. "But you do what you have to do for the people you love." Edward was silent for a moment, processing the devastating wisdom of that child. "Helena, can I ask you a difficult question?" She nodded, though her posture had become more tense. "Do you really trust me?" Helena hesitated, her eyes avoiding his. "I want to trust you, Mr. Miller." But what?" But I've seen a lot of people say nice things and then change their minds. Her voice trembled slightly. What if you wake up one day and realize we're too much work? What if your family doesn't like us? What if... Helena, Edward gently interrupted. Look at me. She reluctantly raised her eyes. I don't have a family, no wife, no children, no parents. A long time ago, I decided it was easier to live alone. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But ever since I met you two, I realized maybe I was just afraid to care about anyone. Miguel had finished his bottle and was rubbing against Helena's shoulder, clearly sleepy. She kissed his forehead with infinite tenderness. You don't understand, sir, Helena whispered. People like us. We can't dream big. When you dream and then lose, it hurts too much. Edward felt his heart clench. What if I promise I won't let you get hurt? Everyone makes promises, Helena replied, getting up to take Miguel back to his room. But promises break. She had reached the kitchen door when she turned to him one last time. Mr. Miller, you're a good person. I feel that. But I can't let Miguel get used to all this if we're just going to have to leave later. You're not going to have to leave, Edward said firmly. Helena smiled sadly. That's what all good people say, until they can't say it anymore. After she left, Edward remained alone in the kitchen, confronted for the first time with the brutal reality of what it meant to earn the trust of children who had been abandoned by the world. He understood that his good intentions and his wealth would not be enough to heal the wounds life had left in that girl's heart. He went up to his room, but couldn't sleep. For the first time in decades, Edward Miller faced a challenge he couldn't solve with money or power. He needed to win something far more precious and fragile, the trust of a child who had learned too early that the world was a dangerous place where people disappeared without warning. The next morning, when he went down for coffee, he found a note on the kitchen table. In childish but careful handwriting, Helena had written, "Thank you for everything. We don't want to bother you anymore. We'll take care of ourselves." The guest room was empty. Helena and Miguel had vanished in the early hours, taking only the clothes on their backs, leaving behind all the gifts and comforts Edward had offered, preferring the uncertainty of the streets to the risk of new disappointment. The rain started even before Edward left the house, transforming the city streets into dark rivers that reflected the streetlights like golden tears. He had cancelled all his meetings for the day, ignored dozens of important calls, and sent his private driver to scour every alley, every square, every shelter that might house two runaway children. "Mr. Miller, we've looked everywhere obvious," Carlos, his driver of 10 years, said, looking in the rearview mirror with concern. "Maybe we should notify the authorities." "No," Edward replied firmly, wiping his rain-soaked face. "Helena ran away precisely to avoid the authorities. If we involve them now, I lose any chance of regaining her trust." 8 hours had passed since he discovered the note in the kitchen. 8 hours of incessant searching, of questioning in every bakery, every hospital, every place where a desperate girl might seek shelter with a baby in her arms. Edward felt an anguish he hadn't experienced since childhood, when he would wake up in different orphanages without knowing where he was, or if anyone cared about his existence. "There, sir." Carlos pointed to a small figure huddled under the awning of a closed pharmacy. Edward jumped out of the car before it even came to a complete stop. It was Helena, drenched to the bone, trembling uncontrollably as she held Miguel against her chest. She had taken off her own coat and wrapped the baby in it, leaving herself exposed to the biting night cold. "Helena." He approached slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. She looked up, and Edward saw in her eyes a mixture of relief and terror that tore him apart inside. "Mr. Miller, we had nowhere to go." Miguel coughed weakly, clearly sick. His lips were bluish from the cold, and he could barely keep his eyes open. Edward took off his own coat and wrapped both children in it, feeling how cold they were. "Why did you run away?" he asked softly, lifting Helena from the ground and carrying her along with Miguel toward the car. Because I got scared, she confessed, sobbing. Because I started to like being at your house, and that scared me. Because Miguel started to smile when he saw you, and I thought if we got used to it and then had to leave, it would be worse than never knowing happiness. Edward placed her in the back seat of the car, adjusting the heat to maximum. Miguel barely reacted, his breathing shallow and erratic. He needs a doctor, Edward said, instructing Carlos to drive to the private hospital where he had contacts. He's going to be okay, isn't he? Helena asked, caressing her brother's feverish face. Please, say he's going to be okay. I couldn't let him die of cold because of my cowardice. He's going to be okay, Edward promised, though his own voice trembled. And you're not a coward, Helena. You're the bravest person I've ever met. I'm not. She shook her head. A brave person wouldn't run from someone who just wanted to help. Edward took her small, cold hand in his. Do you know what I did when I was your age and someone tried to be kind to me? Helena looked at him with curiosity. I kicked her, ran away, because I learned that when people were kind, it was because they wanted something in return, or because they would soon leave. He smiled sadly. It took me 40 years to realize that some people are kind simply because they choose to be. What if you change your mind about us, sir? What if you give me a chance to find out I won't? The hospital appeared ahead, its bright lights cutting through the darkness of the night. As Edward carried Miguel into the emergency room, with Helena clinging to his free hand, he made a silent promise. No matter how many times she ran, how many times she tested his dedication, he would always look for her. Because for the first time in his life, Edward Miller had found something more valuable than money or power. He had found a family worth fighting to keep. 3 days after the rainy night, Miguel had fully recovered from pneumonia. But something fundamental had changed in the dynamic of the small, makeshift family. Helena no longer flinched from Edward's affection, and Miguel had begun to call him Dada in his first attempts at clear words, making the businessman's heart race every time. Edward was in his study, organizing the initial documents for the adoption process, when Maria knocked on the door with a worried expression he immediately recognized. Mr. Miller, there's a lady in the living room insisting on speaking with you. She says she's your sister. Edward felt his blood run cold. Beatrice. They hadn't spoken in almost 2 years, since their last argument over the family inheritance. Where are the children? In the garden, playing with the new ball you brought yesterday. Leave them there and ask them not to come into the house until I tell them. Edward adjusted his tie, mentally preparing for a confrontation he knew was inevitable. Beatrice Miller Albright stood in the center of the living room, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her designer suit impeccable, and an expression of disdain on her lips that Edward had known since childhood. At 42, she had become the personification of the city's elite, beautiful, wealthy, and utterly devoid of empathy. Edward, she didn't even bother to greet him properly. I imagined it was just malicious gossip, but it seems it's true. You've actually brought 2 street children to live in the family home. They're not street children, Beatrice. They are Helena and Miguel. And yes, they live here now. Edward kept his voice steady, though he could feel the tension building in his muscles. Beatrice laughed cruelly. You've always been naive, little brother, but this crosses all boundaries of stupidity. These children obviously saw an opportunity, and you fell for it like a sucker. Watch your words. Edward took a step forward, his voice taking on a dangerous tone he rarely used. Or what? Beatrice raised an eyebrow. You're going to kick me out? Disinherit me as you threatened last time? She walked to the window, watching Helena and Miguel playing in the garden. Look at them, Edward. Look closely. The girl is clever. She's already figured out you're emotionally vulnerable. She's using the baby to manipulate your feelings. You don't know Helena. I know people like her. Beatrice turned, her eyes gleaming with malice. I grew up in the same orphanages as you, remember? I saw hundreds of children who knew exactly how to extract pity and money from lonely adults. Edward felt a rage he hadn't experienced in years. Helena is 7 years old. Beatrice, 7 years old, and the only thing she wants is to protect her brother. Then why did she try to run away? Beatrice smiled triumphantly. Oh, yes, I know. I have my contacts at the hospital where you took the boy. The clever little girl was testing how far your devotion would go, wasn't she? She was scared. She was calculating, Beatrice interrupted coldly, and it worked perfectly. Now you're even more smitten with the fantasy of being a hero, Dad. Edward clenched his fists, fighting the urge to simply throw his sister out of the house. What do you want, Beatrice? I want you to stop this madness before it completely destroys the family's reputation. She approached him, lowering her voice. Do you know what people are saying? A 45-year-old single man who suddenly adopts 2 vulnerable children? The rumors are unsavory. What rumors? Edward felt his stomach churn. Use your imagination. Beatrice smiled cruelly. Especially now that Richard Vance is running for president of the City Business Council against you. He'd love to have ammunition to destroy your candidacy. Edward suddenly understood the true reason for his sister's visit. You're working with Richard. I'm protecting our family's interests, Beatrice replied without shame. If you insist on this insanity, I'll be forced to take more drastic measures. What measures? Beatrice pulled an envelope from her handbag. Here are the phone numbers for 3 investigative journalists and 2 social workers who have concerns about your sudden passion for orphaned children. For now, they're just asking discreet questions. Edward took the envelope with hands trembling in anger. You're threatening me. I'm saving you from yourself. Beatrice headed for the door. Get rid of the children, Edward. Place them in a good institution, donate enough money to ensure they're well cared for, and all this will be forgotten. What if I refuse? Beatrice stopped at the door, without turning around. Then you'll discover that the love you feel for these children might be precisely the weapon that will destroy their lives. After she left, Edward remained alone in the room, watching Helena teach Miguel to walk on the grass outside the window. The pure joy on both their faces contrasted dramatically with the threat he had just received. For the first time since meeting the children, Edward wondered if his love for them would be enough to protect them from the cruel world that was determined to separate them. A week after Beatrice's visit, the first signs of her malicious campaign began to appear. Edward noticed the strange glances from employees during board meetings, the conversations that abruptly ceased when he approached, and the awkward silence that followed his attempts at social interaction. The first blow came through Richard Vance, his rival at the Business Council. During a seemingly casual business lunch, Richard dropped seemingly innocent comments that Edward recognized as pure venom. Edward, my friend, I hear you're going through significant changes in your personal life. Richard smiled, but his eyes remained cold. It's admirable. Your sudden interest in social issues, though some colleagues are wondering about your motivations. Edward kept his expression neutral, though he felt rage simmering in his veins. I don't know what you're talking about, Richard. Oh, your new family. Richard emphasized the word with irony. A man in your position, single, suddenly interested in vulnerable children. It's natural for people to ask questions. What kind of questions? Edward asked, his voice dangerously low. Well, you know how rumors are, especially when they involve unusual situations. Richard leaned forward. Of course, I personally don't believe any of it, but you understand how these things can affect a political campaign, don't you? Edward understood the message perfectly. Give up his candidacy for president of the council or see his reputation destroyed by insinuations about his intentions with the children. That night, at home, Edward watched Helena helping Miguel put together a simple puzzle in the living room. The girl's intense concentration, the infinite patience with which she guided her brother's little hands. The genuine joy when he managed to fit a piece correctly, all of it represented a purity that the outside world was determined to corrupt. Dada Edward. Miguel had finally managed to pronounce the words clearly and now used them constantly, making Edward's heart race every time. "What is it, champ?" "Play more." Miguel held out a puzzle piece, his eyes shining with anticipation. Edward joined them on the floor, but Helena perceived immediately that something was wrong. At 7 years old, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read adult emotions, a survival skill she had learned on the streets. "Mr. Miller, are you worried about something?" she asked, stopping play to study his face. Edward hesitated. How could he explain to a child that adults could be cruel enough to use the love within a family as a weapon? "It's just work, Helena. Nothing important." But Helena was too smart to accept evasions. "Is it about that lady who came here last week? Maria said she left very angry." Edward sighed. There was no way to hide the truth indefinitely. "Some people don't understand our family, Helena. They think it's strange for a single man to want to take care of 2 children." "Do they think you're a bad person?" Helena asked, her voice small and worried. "Not exactly. They just ask questions." Helena processed this for a moment, then moved closer to Edward and held his hand. "Mr. Miller, if these people are causing problems because of us, maybe it's better if we leave." "No," Edward replied with a firmness that surprised him. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home now." "But what if—" "Helena, look at me." Edward knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. "When you were on the street with Miguel, did you give up on him when things got tough?" "Never," Helena answered without hesitation. "Then why do you think I would give up on you?" Helena's eyes filled with tears. "Because we're not really your children. We're just children you helped." Edward felt something break in his chest. "Helena, you are my children in every way that matters. And real families don't abandon each other when things get complicated." Miguel, sensing the emotional tension in the air, toddled over and hugged Edward's leg. "Dada sad." Edward picked him up, embracing Helena too. "No, Miguel, Dada isn't sad. Dada is determined." That night, after the children were asleep, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He picked up the phone and called his personal attorney. "Roberto, I need you to expedite the adoption process. I don't care how much it costs or how many favors you have to call in. I want Helena and Miguel to be legally my children as quickly as possible." "Edward, are you sure? With the rumors circulating, perhaps it would be better to wait." "The rumors are precisely the reason I can't wait," Edward interrupted. "The longer they go without legal protection, the more vulnerable they become." After hanging up, Edward stayed awake until dawn, planning his strategy. If Beatrice and Richard wanted a war, they'd get one. But this time, Edward would fight not just for himself, but for 2 children who had transformed his empty house into a home full of love. And he didn't intend to lose. The second week brought more direct and disturbing consequences. Edward arrived home on a Thursday evening to find Maria visibly agitated at the entrance, her hands trembling as she held an official envelope. "Mr. Miller, this arrived today. 2 men in suits brought it and said it was urgent." She hesitated. "And there's something else. Since this morning, there's been a car parked on the street with 2 men inside. They're just watching the house." Edward tore open the envelope, his eyes quickly scanning the official document. It was a summons from Child Protective Services requesting a routine inspection of the living conditions of the children in his care. The date set was for 3 days from now. "Where are Helena and Miguel?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "In their room playing Mr. Miller. They don't know anything yet." But Helena asked many questions about the men in the car. Edward walked up the stairs with heavy steps, each tread echoing like a storm warning. He found Helena sitting on the bed, reading a story to Miguel, who was leaning against her with his thumb in his mouth. "Hi, Dada Edward," Miguel shouted when he saw him, stretching out his little arms. Edward picked him up, But Helena immediately sensed his tension. Something bad happened, didn't it? There was no hiding it. Helena was too smart and had lived long enough to recognize the signs of trouble. Some people from the state will be coming here on Monday to see how you're being cared for. Helena's face instantly paled. Are they going to take us away? I won't let that happen. Edward sat on the bed beside her, still holding Miguel. But I need you both to help me. On Monday. These people will ask questions. You just need to tell the truth about how you're being treated here. What if they don't believe us? Helena's voice was small, filled with fear. They will believe it because it's the truth. Edward kissed Miguel's forehead. The baby had started to sense the tension in the air and was growing restless. Helena, do you trust me? Yes, she replied without hesitation, but Edward could see the terror in her eyes. Then believe me when I say I won't let anyone separate our family. Over the weekend that followed, Edward meticulously prepared for the visit. He organized all of Miguel's medical documents, Helena's enrollment records for the private school where he had just enrolled her, and proof that both children were receiving adequate care. But on Monday morning, when the social workers arrived, Edward immediately realized it wasn't a routine visit. There were 4 people, 2 social workers, a psychologist, and a supervisor with a severe expression who made it clear from the first moment that she had already arrived with preconceived notions. Mr. Miller, the supervisor, who introduced herself as Dr. Sylvia Quinn, spoke with professional coldness. We are here due to some concerns that have been raised about the suitability of this guardianship arrangement. What kind of concerns? Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. A single man with no prior experience with children who suddenly decides to adopt 2 vulnerable children found on the street. She consulted her notes. The profile raises questions about motivations and suitability of the environment. Edward felt his anger boil, but kept his voice controlled. I'd like to know who made these allegations. That is confidential. But I can tell you, they came from sources concerned about the children's well-being. For the next 3 hours, Edward watched as strangers scoured his home, questioned his motivations, and finally called Helena and Miguel for separate interviews. Seeing the terror on Helena's face as she was led into another room almost broke his composure. The psychologist, Dr. Adams, was at least more sensitive than the supervisor. After talking to the children, he pulled Edward aside. Mr. Miller, I need to be honest with you. The children clearly love you and feel safe here. Helena is articulate, intelligent, and shows genuine affection. Miguel obviously sees you as a father figure. Edward felt a momentary relief. So there are no problems, Dr. Adams hesitated. From a psychological standpoint, no, but there are external pressures influencing this case. Someone with significant influence wants these children removed from here. And that's enough. It could be. Dr. Adams lowered his voice. Mr. Miller, I suggest you consider alternatives. Perhaps a traditional family, a married couple who could adopt the children. It would be easier to defend legally. Edward looked out the window where Helena sat in the garden with Miguel in her lap, humming softly to calm him after the morning's stress. The idea of handing them over to strangers, even well-intentioned ones, was physically painful. Doctor, can I ask you a question? Edward turned to him. If these were your children, would you give them away? Dr. Adams followed his gaze to the garden. No, he admitted softly, but I also wouldn't have powerful enemies determined to destroy my family. When everyone left, Dr. Quinn left one last warning. Mr. Miller, our assessment will be completed in 1 week. I suggest you use that time to carefully consider what is best for these children. That night, Helena refused to leave Edward's side, sleeping on the living room sofa to be near him. Dada, Edward, she whispered in the darkness. If they take us away, will you try to find us? Helena, I would go to the ends of the earth to find you both, Edward replied, and for the first time in his life, he fully understood the meaning of the words he had just uttered. The revelation came through an unexpected source. Roberto, Edward's attorney, appeared on Tuesday morning with a grim expression and a folder full of documents that trembled slightly in his hands. "Edward, you need to see this." Roberto closed the office door behind him. "I got information about who's behind the allegations, and it's worse than we imagined." Edward put down his coffee cup, his stomach clenching. "Beatrice. Not just Beatrice. Richard Vance has set up a systematic operation to destroy your candidacy and your reputation." Roberto spread the documents across the table. "Look at this. Proof of payments to 3 Child Protective Services officials, including Dr. Sylvia Quinn." Edward examined the papers, feeling his anger grow with each line he read. They bribed public officials to persecute 2 innocent children. "It gets worse." Roberto turned a page. "Here's proof that Richard hired private investigators to follow you. The men in the car Maria saw, the indiscreet questions about your motivations. It was all orchestrated. And Beatrice, your sister provided the initial contacts and helped spread the rumors in elite social circles." Roberto paused. "Edward, there's something else. They don't just plan to take the children from you. They plan to separate them." Edward's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "Helena would be placed with an adoptive family here in the state. Miguel would be sent to an orphanage in another city." Roberto lowered his voice. "The official justification would be that it's easier to find families for single children than for siblings together." Edward clenched his fists, trying to control the fury that threatened to explode from him. The cruelty of that plan surpassed anything he had imagined. Separating Helena from Miguel would be like tearing out both their hearts. "How did you get this information?" "Dr. Adams. He was so disturbed by what he discovered that he violated protocol to reach out to me." Roberto leaned forward. "He said he'd never seen such an elaborate conspiracy against a family, and that the children clearly love you." Edward stood up, walking to the window where he could see Helena teaching Miguel to draw in the garden. The girl's concentration, the infinite patience with which she held the crayon in his little hand, the proud smile when he made a scribble that she praised as if it were a work of art. All of it was about to be destroyed by greed and political ambition. "How much time do we have?" "The final decision will be made Friday." "But Edward," Roberto hesitated, "even with this evidence, it will be difficult to reverse the process. They covered their tracks well, and the bribed officials can claim they acted out of genuine concern. What if I make it all public, expose the corruption in the media? You would risk looking like a desperate man making up conspiracy theories. And worse, it could accelerate the process of removing the children." Edward returned to the table, studying the documents with renewed attention. "Roberto, I need you to do something for me. I want a meeting with Beatrice and Richard tonight." Edward, "Are you sure that's... They want to play dirty, then let's play." Edward picked up the phone, "But this time, I hold the cards." The meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock that evening in Edward's office. Beatrice arrived first, elegant as always, but with a visible tension around her eyes. Richard appeared minutes later, his usual confidence slightly shaken by the urgency of the summons. "Edward, and how dramatic." Beatrice settled into the armchair as if she were at home. "I hope you've finally seen reason and decided to do the right thing." "Oh, I've seen many things." Edward pushed the folder of documents across the table. "Like these bank transfers to public officials, for example." The color drained from Richard's face. Beatrice tried to maintain her composure, but Edward saw her hands tremble slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Richard tried to bluff, but his voice had lost all authority. "Corruption of public officials, conspiracy to separate minors, misuse of political influence." Edward listed calmly. "Each of these accusations can result in jail time." "You can't prove anything." Beatrice stood up, but her voice sounded less convincing. "I can, and I will." Edward also stood, facing them both. "Unless you immediately stop this persecution of my children." "Your children?" Richard laughed bitterly. "Edward, do you really believe you can buy a family?" Edward walked to the window, where he could see the light on in the children's room. Helena was probably reading a story to Miguel before bed, as she did every night. "I didn't buy a family, Richard. I found one." He turned to face them both. "And I won't let you destroy it." "What if we refuse to stop?" Beatrice challenged. Edward smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. "Then tomorrow morning these documents will be on the desk of every district attorney in the city, along with a copy for the press. Let's see how your reputations withstand the scandal." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Edward knew he had played his best cards, but still didn't know if it would be enough to save his family. The next morning, Edward woke to the sound of raised voices coming from the garden. When he looked out the window, he saw Helena running toward the house, carrying Miguel in her arms, while two social workers followed her with determined steps. His blood ran cold when he recognized Dr. Sylvia Quinn among them. He ran downstairs, reaching the living room just as Helena entered through the back door, breathless and teary-eyed. "Dada, Edward," she cried, running towards him. "They said they came to get us." Edward hugged her, along with Miguel, feeling the two children trembling against his body. "No one is taking you anywhere." Dr. Quinn entered the room with authority, followed by two men Edward didn't recognize. "Mr. Miller, we have a court order for the immediate removal of the children. Investigations have revealed serious irregularities in your ability to provide adequate care." "What irregularities?" Edward kept the children behind him, his voice dangerously low. "Emotional instability, an unsuitable environment for child development, and questions about your motivations for keeping vulnerable children in your care." She spoke the words as if they were established facts. Edward immediately recognized the vocabulary Beatrice and Richard had constructed to destroy him. "Dr. Quinn, you're being very well paid to destroy a family, aren't you?" Her face hardened. "Mr. Miller, I will not tolerate insinuations." "They are not insinuations." Edward pulled out a copy of the documents Roberto had obtained from his pocket. "They are proof. You received $40,000 to ensure these children were removed from my home." For a moment, the silence was absolute. Helena clutched Edward's leg tighter, whispering, "Dada, Edward, don't let them take us." Dr. Quinn regained her composure with visible effort. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Miller, but they don't change the fact that we have a court order. An order based on false accusations and bought testimonies." Edward took a step forward. "But you know what? You win." Helena looked up, confused. "Dada, Edward." Edward knelt down, meeting her eyes. "Helena, remember when you asked me if I would give up on you when things got tough?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I said that real families don't abandon each other." Edward took her face in his hands. "Sometimes, loving someone means making immense sacrifices to protect them." "I don't understand," Helena whispered. Edward stood, facing Dr. Quinn. "I renounce all my assets. Everything. The company, the properties, the bank accounts. Everything will go into a trust fund managed by an independent institution." "Mr. Miller, what are you doing?" Helena asked, panic evident in her voice. "I'm proving that you two are more important than money or power," Edward continued, his voice gaining strength. "Dr. Quinn, when I no longer have wealth to arouse suspicion, when there are no more financial motivations to question, what excuse will you use?" Dr. Quinn blinked, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. "Mr. Miller, this is an unnecessary gesture." "No, it is necessary." Edward picked up the phone and dialed Roberto. "Roberto? Yes, do it now. All the papers we prepared. I want that by the end of the day. I have nothing left but enough to support a simple family." Miguel started to cry, sensing the tension in the air without understanding what was happening. Helena picked him up. rocking him as she looked at Edward with a mixture of admiration and terror. "Mr. Miller, you don't have to do this for us," she said, her voice broken. "I'm not doing it for you, Helena. I'm doing it for us, for our family." Edward turned again to Dr. Quinn. "Now tell me, does a man who gave up a fortune to stay with 2 children still seem suspicious to you?" One of the men accompanying Dr. Quinn whispered something in her ear. Edward saw the exact moment she realized her plan had collapsed. Without the financial motivation, without the class difference, the entire narrative built to separate them became unsustainable. We need to reevaluate the situation," Dr. Quinn stammered. "The court order might need to be reviewed in light of these new circumstances." "Do that," Edward said firmly, "and the next time you take money to destroy a family, remember that some values cannot be bought." After they left, Helena continued to look at Edward with an expression of disbelief at what she had witnessed. "Dada, Edward, did you lose everything because of us?" Edward smiled, hugging both children. "No, Helena, I gained everything." But even as he spoke those words, Edward knew the battle was not over yet. Beatrice and Richard would not give up easily, and he had just disarmed himself financially. The real war was just beginning. Beatrice and Richard's response to Edward's gesture was crueler than he could have imagined. The following Monday, when Edward arrived home after signing the last papers transferring his assets, he found Maria crying in the kitchen and the house strangely silent. "Where are the children?" he asked, a cold terror spreading through his chest. "They took Helena, Mr. Miller," Maria sobbed. 2 couples came with official papers. They said they found an adoptive family for her, but that she couldn't finish the sentence. "But what, Maria?" "That they only wanted the girl. Miguel stayed here because no one wants to adopt a baby, along with an older child." Edward felt his world crumble around him. Miguel was sleeping in his crib in the bedroom, oblivious to the fact that his sister, the only mother he had ever known, had been ripped from his life. Helena, who had sacrificed everything for her brother's well-being, was now separated from him exactly as she had always feared. Where did they take her? To a family in Springfield, a town 2 hours away. The Scotts. They said she'd get a good education, adopted siblings. Maria wiped her eyes. But Mr. Miller, the girl screamed so much. She begged them not to separate her from Miguel. It was heartbreaking. Edward grabbed his car keys with hands trembling in anger. "Maria, take care of Miguel. I'm going to get Helena." The Scott's house was an imposing mansion in a gated community in Springfield. Edward rang the doorbell insistently until a middle-aged man, visibly annoyed, answered the door. "You must be Edward Miller." The man, who introduced himself as Dr. Roger Scott, spoke with disdain. "We were expecting you to show up. I want to see Helena. Her name is now Beatrice, as her new adoptive mother chose." "Doctor," Scott crossed his arms. "And no, you cannot see her. She's adjusting to her new life." Edward forced his way in, entering the house against the man's will. "Helena! Helena! Where are you? Dada! Edward!" Her voice came from upstairs, desperate and full of relief. Edward ran up the stairs, finding Helena locked in an attic room. When he opened the door, she threw herself into his arms, sobbing. "They locked me in here because I wouldn't stop crying for Miguel," she whispered. "Dada, Edward, they're mean people. The lady yells at me when I cry, and the man said, if I don't stop being dramatic, they'll send me to a place where difficult children stay quiet." Edward felt a homicidal rage. "No one is going to make you quiet, Helena. You have the right to cry, to miss your brother, to be a child. But they said now I'm their daughter, and I have to forget my old life." Helena clung to him tightly. "Dada, Edward, take me back home. Please." Dr. Scott had come upstairs behind him with 2 security guards. "Mr. Miller, you are trespassing on private property. The girl is now legally our daughter. She has a name, and it's Helena." Edward stood up, carrying the girl in his arms. "And there's nothing legal about what you're doing." We have all the necessary documentation, Doctor. Scott's wife appeared at the top of the stairs, a cold woman with hard eyes. The child will adapt. They all adapt, eventually. Edward understood with horror that the Scotts were not a family wanting to love a child. They were cruel people who used adoption as a way to get a domestic servant. Helena was not a daughter to them. She was property. Helena is not staying here, Edward declared. Yes, she is. Dr. Scott gestured to the security guards. And you're leaving now, or we're calling the police? Call them, Edward challenged. When they arrive, I'll show them the room where you locked up a 7-year-old child. I'll tell them about the threats, about how you're trying to force her to forget her own brother. That's when Helena did something that changed everything. In a clear, strong voice, she said, I want to speak with a judge. I want to tell a judge how these people treated me. Dr. Scott paled. The girl doesn't know what she's saying. Yes, I do. Helena raised her head with courage. I'm 7 years old, but I know when adults are cruel, and I know I have the right to say who I want to live with. Edward smiled proudly. In that moment, Helena was no longer the scared child he had found on the streets. She was a brave girl, fighting for her own family. Very well, he said, taking his cell phone from his pocket. We'll call a judge right now. The call Edward made was not to a judge, it was to every journalist he knew. In 2 hours, the Scott's house was surrounded by reporters, TV cameras, and finally, real authorities who came to investigate the allegations. When Helena finally told her story to the cameras, with the natural eloquence of a child who had always had to fight to survive, Beatrice and Richard's entire conspiracy began to publicly unravel. I just want to stay with my brother and my dada Edward, she said to the cameras. They tried to separate us, but real family never gives up on each other. That night, Edward took Helena back home, where Miguel was waiting awake, as if he knew his sister would return. When she picked him up, whispering that they would never be separated again, Edward knew they had won the most important battle of their lives. The national repercussion of Helena's story transformed the case into a symbol of the fight against corruption in the adoption system. During the week following Helena's rescue, Edward received hundreds of calls of support, donations from moved families, and most importantly, the attention of honest prosecutors determined to thoroughly investigate Beatrice and Richard's scheme. The first consequence came quickly. Dr. Sylvia Quinn was suspended from her duties and indicted for passive corruption. The Scotts had their adoption license permanently revoked, and an investigation revealed that they had adopted 3 other children under the same conditions as Helena. All were removed and placed with genuinely loving families. Richard Vance, publicly exposed as the mastermind of the scheme, not only lost his candidacy for the City Business Council presidency, but also had his company investigated for fraudulent practices. Within days, his empire built on corruption began to crumble. Beatrice, confronted with irrefutable evidence of her participation in the scheme, made one last desperate attempt to save her own reputation. She appeared at Edward's house on a Thursday morning, this time without her usual arrogance, but with tears in her eyes. Edward, I didn't know they were going to do that to the children. She tried to justify herself. I thought it was just a matter of political influence. I didn't imagine that they would hurt 2 innocent children. Edward interrupted, watching Helena play with Miguel in the garden through the window. Beatrice, you always knew exactly what you were doing. Please, I need you to drop the charges. My kids are being humiliated at school. My husband might lose his job. Beatrice sobbed. I'm your sister. Edward turned to face her. Helena is my daughter. Miguel is my son. They are my family now, and I protect my family. But our blood family isn't blood, Beatrice. It's choice, it's love, it's sacrifice. Edward opened the door. You chose to harm 2 children for greed. Now live with the consequences. The final adoption hearing took place on a sunny October morning. Exactly 7 weeks after that first meeting on the street, the judge, Judge David Thompson had followed all the repercussions of the case and called a special public hearing. Edward entered the courtroom holding Helena's hand and carrying Miguel in his arms. The room was packed. Journalists, families who had followed the story, honest social workers who wanted to see justice done. "Mr. Edward Miller," the judge began, "this case has had national repercussions and exposed serious flaws in our child protection system. But at the heart of all this turmoil, I see one very simple thing: a family fighting to stay together." Helena, who had visibly grown during those difficult weeks, asked permission to speak. "Your Honor, I wanted to say something." Judge Thompson smiled gently. "You may speak, Helena. When I offered my money to Dada Edward to take care of Miguel, I didn't know he was going to become our real dad." Her voice was clear and strong. "I just knew he had kind eyes. But then I found out he also has a kind heart. And that family isn't about having the same blood, it's about having the same love." Miguel, as if understanding the importance of the moment, stretched out his little arms to Edward and said clearly, "Dada!" There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Judge Thompson brought down his gavel. "Edward Miller, in view of the extremely positive psychological reports, the clear demonstration of love and dedication from both parties, and considering the best interests of the children, I hereby formalize the adoption of Helena Miller and Miguel Miller." The courtroom erupted in applause. Edward hugged his children, now officially his children, feeling his heart could burst with happiness. Dr. Adams, the psychologist who had helped expose the scheme, approached after the ceremony. "Mr. Miller, in 20 years of my career, I've never seen such a beautiful transformation. That scared little girl I met has become a courageous and confident young woman. And Miguel, he radiated happiness today." Edward looked at Helena, who was showing the adoption certificate to Miguel, explaining with infinite patience that they were now a family forever. "Doctor, can I confess something?" Edward smiled. "I'm the one who was adopted by them. They taught me what a real family is." That afternoon, in the simple house they had rented after Edward donated his fortune, the three sat on the living room floor for a drawing session. Helena drew a house with 3 figures holding hands, one tall, one medium, and one small. Above it, in her careful handwriting, she wrote, "My family." Miguel, with her help, made colorful scribbles that she interpreted as butterflies of joy. Edward looked around the modest house. No golden chandeliers, no expensive artworks, no servants, and realized he had never been so rich in his life. "Dada Edward," Helena said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for teaching me that true love is worth all the treasures in the world," Edward replied, kissing both their foreheads. Outside, the rain began to fall softly, but inside the small, loving home, the sun shone eternally. 6 months after the official adoption, Edward woke to the familiar sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. It was Saturday morning, and Helena was teaching Miguel how to make pancakes, a tradition they had created on weekends. He stayed in bed for a few minutes, just listening to the pure joy in his children's voices, savoring a happiness he never imagined possible. "Dada Edward!" Miguel shouted when he saw him enter the kitchen. "I made pancake!" The pancake was an irregular disc, burnt at the edges, but Miguel radiated so much pride that Edward ate it as if it were the best meal of his life. Helena, now 8 years old, had transformed into a confident and radiant girl. Her grades at school were exceptional, and she had discovered herself to be a natural storyteller, always inventing fantastic tales to entertain Miguel before bed. "Dada, my teacher said my essay about family was the best in the class." Helena showed him a paper with a large golden star. "Want me to read it to you?" Edward sat at the table, Miguel on his lap, while Helena read in a clear voice, "My family didn't start with birth, it started with choice. My father found me on a cold street, but brought me to a home full of warmth. I learned that family isn't about DNA, it's about heart. It's about being willing to sacrifice everything for those you love. My father did that for us, and we do that for him every day." Edward felt his eyes well up with tears. "Helena, that's beautiful. It's true, isn't it?" She came closer and hugged them both. "We really are a true family." Miguel, almost 3 years old now, had become a healthy and happy child, with no memory of the difficult days on the street. To him, Edward had always been Dada, and Helena had always been his older sister who protected and cared for him with unconditional love. "Dada, are we going to the park today?" Miguel asked, his eyes shining with anticipation. "Of course, champ. But first, Dada has a surprise for you." Edward went to his study and returned with 2 wrapped packages. Helena opened hers first. It was a new diary with a leather cover and her name engraved in gold. "For your stories," Edward explained. "One day, when you're a famous writer, I want you to remember where it all began." Miguel opened his and found a handmade rag doll with a blue dress, exactly like the one Helena had seen in the window months ago when she was still collecting coins in hopes of buying it. "Is it for Miguel?" Helena asked, surprised. "It's for both of you." Edward smiled. "So you remember that sometimes dreams come true in ways we never imagined." Helena held the doll with reverence, remembering how she had given it up to save her brother. Now, it represented something much bigger. It represented the full circle of her journey. That afternoon, in the park where they took Miguel every weekend, Edward watched his children playing and reflected on the transformation of their lives. He had lost a fortune, but gained a family. He had given up power and influence, but found purpose and meaning. Helena ran up to him, breathless from playing. "Dada Edward, can I ask you a question?" "Always." "Do you regret losing all that money because of us?" Edward pulled her into a hug, watching Miguel trying to convince a group of children to play family with him. "Helena, I'm going to tell you a secret. I didn't lose anything. I invested everything in the most valuable thing in the world." "In what?" "In love, and the return was infinite." Helena smiled, that radiant smile that had captured Edward's heart from day one. "I love you, Dada. I love you both too, more than all the words in the world could express." When they returned home at dusk, Edward paused for a moment at the entrance, looking at the simple house that had become his paradise. There were no golden chandeliers or imported marble, but there was something far more precious: laughter echoing through the hallways, drawings taped to the refrigerator, toys scattered across the living room, and the unconditional love of 2 children who had transformed a lonely man into a proud father. That night, like every other, Helena read a story to Miguel while Edward tidied up the house. When he went to say goodnight, he found them both sleeping together in Helena's bed, the blue-dressed doll protected between them. Edward lovingly covered his 2 children, whispering, "Thank you for teaching me that true wealth is not in what we have, but in whom we love." Outside, the city maintained its frantic pace, but inside that small, loving home, 3 hearts beat in perfect synchronicity, knowing they had found in each other everything they had always sought: a true family, built not by chance or biology, but by the deliberate choice to love unconditionally. The crumpled bills Helena had offered months ago were framed on the living room wall, not as a reminder of poverty, but as a symbol that true love is the only treasure that multiplies when shared. And so, under the stars, Edward Miller, Helena Miller, and Miguel Miller slept the peaceful sleep of those who knew that no matter what happened, they would never be alone again.